In the autumn of 1942, Admiral Karl Dönitz reviewed a map of the North Atlantic and permitted himself something close to satisfaction. There was a corridor out there, a vast, empty rectangle of gray water sitting between Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores that no Allied aircraft could reach. The nearest British airfields could graze its eastern edge. American bases in Newfoundland could touch its western boundary. But the center? 600 miles of open ocean in every direction, sitting in permanent darkness. No patrol bomber could cross it. No escort destroyer could be everywhere at once. Dönitz's crews had a name for it. They called it the Black Pit. This was not merely a geographic feature. It was the logistical lung of the entire U-boat campaign. Inside the Black Pit, a wolf pack could surface, communicate, maneuver, and attack with something approaching impunity. And Dönitz had built his entire strategic doctrine around that single fact. The calculation was brutal in its simplicity. If his U-boats could sink Allied merchant vessels faster than the combined industrial capacity of Britain, Canada, and the United States could replace them, the supply chain feeding the British Isles would collapse. Britain would starve. The Soviet Union, deprived of Lend-Lease materiel, would buckle. And any future Allied invasion of Western Europe would die on a planning table before it ever reached a beach. This was not fantasy. In the first 6 months of 1942, the U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. The American eastern seaboard became a killing ground so systematic that the U-boat crews recorded it in their war diaries as the second happy time. Every gallon of aviation fuel for Spitfires over Malta, every Sherman tank bound for North Africa, every artillery shell earmarked for the Red Army, all of it floated on merchant hulls, and all of those hulls, somewhere in the Middle Passage, entered the Black Pit, where the sky was empty, where the escorts, stretched thin across 500-mile convoy fronts, could not close the geometry fast enough, where a surfaced U-boat running hard on diesel engines at night could shadow a convoy for days before the attack began. The depth charge technology of 1941 was, from the U-boat commander's perspective, a manageable threat. ASDIC, the system the Americans called sonar, lost contact with a diving submarine in the final 100 meters of an attack run. That dead time, 15 to 30 seconds, was enough for a competent helmsman to alter course and depth. The ballistic anomaly of hitting a three-dimensional moving target in a sound-distorting medium meant that even well-executed depth charge patterns frequently detonated in open water.
Dönitz had studied the First World War's submarine campaign with the obsessive precision of an engineer reviewing a failed structural calculation. He knew where the seams were. And in the autumn of 1942, looking at that map, the seams still appeared to be in his favor. What he could not yet see was that the industrial capacity of the United States was not operating on his timetable. It was operating on its own. In the spring of 1943, the USS Bogue, CVE-9, entered the North Atlantic. She was not a fleet carrier. She displaced 7,800 tons, made 18 knots in calm water, and her crews called her a jeep carrier. Built in Kaiser's West Coast yards at a production rate the Kriegsmarine's intelligence analysts refused to believe when the numbers filtered back to Berlin. Her flight deck was 496 feet, modest by any fleet standard, but she carried Grumman TBF Avengers fitted with the new 10-centimeter radar, and she moved with the convoy. That last detail was everything. For the first time in the history of the Atlantic campaign, a convoy in the Black Pit had air cover that did not need to go home. The geometry of what the escort carrier introduced was not primarily a question of hardware. It was a question of the Wolfpack's nervous system. Dönitz's Rudeltaktik, the coordinated multi-boat attack doctrine, was a radio-dependent organism. Patrol lines spread across 200 miles of ocean, each boat waiting for a contact report, then vectoring in on high-frequency transmissions from the sighting boat. Remove the radio, make transmission acutely dangerous, and the Wolfpack becomes a collection of isolated submarines, each blind to the others, incapable of the coordinated geometry that had made it lethal. High-frequency direction finding did exactly that. HFDF, Huff-Duff to every operator who worked it, fitted to convoy escort destroyers, could take a bearing on a U-boat transmission within 30 seconds of it beginning. 2 ships cross-bearing gave a position accurate to 5 miles. An escort commander who received that data could detach a destroyer at 30 knots on that bearing, and the U-boat, which could not complete its dive in under 45 seconds, would still be on the surface when the destroyer arrived. The dead time problem compressed from a tactical advantage into a death sentence. But what the METOX receiver, the German radar detector fitted to every operational U-boat by mid-1942, could not detect was a radar operating at 10 centimeters. The new ASV Mark III centimetric sets, fitted to very long-range Liberators and Sunderland flying boats, emitted on a wavelength that passed entirely beneath METOX's detection threshold. From the U-boat crew's perspective, the aircraft that attacked them in the spring of 1943 arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was empty. The next moment, the lee light, a retractable 24-inch searchlight in the aircraft's ventral housing, was illuminating the conning tower at a mile's range. The darkness that U-boat commanders had used as a defensive medium for 3 years was no longer available. And threading through all of it was the industrial math that Dönitz had failed to model accurately. Henry Kaiser's prefabricated Liberty ships were replacing merchant tonnage faster than the Wolfpacks could sink it. His escort carrier yards were delivering hulls on a schedule the Kriegsmarine classified as a fabricated number. The Consolidated Aircraft Plant in Fort Worth was producing B-24 Liberators in very long-range maritime patrol variants at a rate that allowed the Army Air Forces to simultaneously bomb Germany and still send enough aircraft to Coastal Command to close the gap. 4 threads, all arriving together in the spring of 1943. In May 1943, the Atlantic War reached its inflection point. Not gradually. The Kriegsmarine's operational logs record the change with the clinical abruptness of a structural failure. One week, the Wolfpacks were operating with familiar confidence. The next week, boats were not returning. Then more boats. Then the sinking reports from the convoy routes, which had flowed into Lorient with the regularity of a production line for 2 years, simply stopped. 41 U-boats lost in 31 days. Against a force sustaining losses of 15 to 20 per month and still maintaining tactical pressure, 41 was not a reversal, it was an institutional hemorrhage. Dönitz had been training crews since 1935, 18 months from enlistment to combat readiness. He was now losing them faster than the training pipeline could replace them. The surviving commanders who made it back to port reported not a tactical defeat, but an environmental transformation. Aircraft were appearing over convoys hundreds of miles beyond any known Allied airbase. Radar contacts were arriving without METOX warning. Depth charge patterns were precise and persistent. Escort groups were coordinating in ways that closed every standard evasion geometry. The Black Pit, the geographic fact that the entire tonnage Krieg had been built upon, had disappeared. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz withdrew the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The order was not a tactical redeployment, it was a confession. The logistical lung of the Atlantic campaign had been sutured shut in a single month, and there was no immediate technical remedy. The psychological dimension of what followed is worth examining in its own right, because it reveals something important about what industrial capacity actually does to an enemy's institutional morale. The U-boat crews of 1940 and 1941 had been good, genuinely good. Their training was rigorous. Their commanders were, in several cases, tactically gifted beyond anything the Allied escorts had the tools to counter. Those early victories were real victories, earned against real opposition. The men who survived them understood their own competence. What 1943 introduced was something they had not been prepared for. They were not being outfought, they were being outproduced. The aircraft over the convoys were not the result of superior tactics. They were the result of American factories building enough of them, with enough range, with enough radar, to be everywhere at once. The escort carriers were not a technological revolution. They were a manufacturing decision, executed at Kaiser's yards with the same industrial logic Henry Ford had applied to the Model T: systematic, replicable, relentless. The Liberty Ship program delivered over 2,700 hulls by 1945. The Escort Carrier program delivered over 150 vessels. The Willow Run plant was building B-24s at 1 per hour by 1944. These are not military statistics, they are manufacturing statistics. And manufacturing achievements do not depend on weather or tide or the judgment of an individual commander on any given night. They depend on logistics, tooling, trained labor, and supply chains. They are, in the precise sense of the word, unstoppable. The last U-boat sunk in the North Atlantic by a Liberator operating from airfields that the Black Pit had once placed safely out of reach went down with all hands in gray water that no longer had a gap in its sky. The men who built that aircraft never saw the ocean their work was watching over. They were assembly workers in Fort Worth and San Diego and Willow Run, working double shifts under fluorescent lights, building aluminum airframes to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The Black Pit closed in May 1943. The math had caught up, and it never fell behind again.